Magitavach, I'm now going to record Daf Tzadik. We're up to Daf Kuf. We're up to Daf Tzadik Tes Amud Beis at the bottom, 2 lines from the bottom. Zok the Gemara. Omar Rava. Rava says, Pshitali, it's simple to me. We know that in order to make an akira has to be on a davar hamunach, something which is lying firm and steady, and you're making akira from that position. So Rava says, Pshitali, it's simple to me. If you take water off the top of a body of water, it's considered an akira, because water on water, that's how water normally rests, and that's considered its rest place, so the akira counts. Ego is agabi mayim, but if you have a walnut on water, since walnuts are not steady on water, is lav haina nechasan, that's not considered its resting place. Boy Rava wondered, ego is bekli, a kli tzaf al gabi mayim. If you have a walnut in a cup, the cup is floating on the water, mahu. Is taking the walnut out of the cup considered an akira? Is the walnut in the cup considered in a place which is munach? Miyam rinan, do we say basar ego is as linan? Let's look at the walnut, and it is v'honayich. It is in a cup, and that's considered as resting place. Oidilmer, maybe the entire cup is holding the walnut. Basar keli as linan. We should look at the keli. V'oleinayich, and the keli on the water is not firm. And teku, the Gemara does not come to a conclusion, because according to the Rambam, the reason why akira has to come from a mokam amunach, in order to be an akira, it has to come from a mokam choshev. The question is, how choshev is it when the echo is in the keli, but the keli is floating on water? The Gemara does not have a conclusion. This we had already before in the first parik. Shemen al gabi yayin. If you have oil floating on top of wine, if you take the oil off the wine, is that considered an akira from a place where it's nach? That's a machlekes of Yochanan and Menur v'Rabbanan in a Mishnah in Tvul Yain. Now the Mishnah says in Tvul Yain, Shemen shotzaf al gabi yayin. If you have oil of truma, which is floating on top of wine, shel truma, v'noga Tvul Yain, the Tvul Yain touches b'shemen, the oil on top, lo pasal elo shemen. He only makes pasal shemen on top. He makes it shlishi. But the yayin under it is not affected, because the shemen and yayin are considered two different bodies. Rabbi Yochanan and Nuri, since they're both fluids, sheneim chibur zel lezeh, they're both considered one fluid mass. So according to Rabbi Yochanan and Nuri, if both are one fluid mass, so therefore if the Tvul Yain touches the shemen on top, he's also paisel the yayin. And vuadin, if it's one fluid mass, then it's like water on water. If you take oil off the yayin, it's considered an akira. According to the Tanakama, if the Tvul Yain touches the shemen on top, it doesn't affect the yayin because it's two separate masses. The shemen can become a shlishi, but the yayin below can't become a revi because there's no revi b'truma. So therefore, the Gabi Shabbos, if you take the shemen off the yayin, it's not considered an akira because it's two different masses, and therefore it's not stationary. Amar Abaya said, Bor b'Reshus Harabim, if you have a well in a Reshus Harabim, Amuka Asor Chava Shemaina, if it's 10 tfachim deep and 8 tfachim wide, Mezorak L'toicha Machzalas, and you throw a mat into it, you're chayiv, because you were machnes Reshus Hayochin into this Reshus, you were machnes from Reshus Harabim into this Reshus Hayochin. By the way, Rishonim ask, L'chayr, if this bor is Amuka Asora, the moment you throw a mat down or lands at the bottom, isn't that Memayit the bor Me Asora Tfachim? Shouldn't that be Rabbi Yochanan and Shaila? If you have a hanoch at the same time that you're being mevatel Reshus Hayochid from its depth of 10 tefachim. So there's two terutzim in the Rishonim. The Meiri brings b'shem many meforshim. When the Gemara said Amuka Asor was lav dafka, it meant more than 10 tefachim deep. So when the mat lands at the bottom, you haven't really been memayed the Reshus Hayochid. According to the Rashba, he says when you throw the mat down the bottom of the pit, you don't really intend for the mat to stay there. So therefore, you deposited a mat into a pit which is Asor Tfachim, that's considered Hachnasa Mir Reshus Harabim Reshus Hayochid, but you haven't diminished the pit. But Chilka b'Machzel is Potter. Abaya says, what happens if you divide the pit with a Machzelas? So now you make each side less than Arba l'Arba, it was 8. Machzelas takes away a little bit of space, so you have less than 4 on each side. So now you're Potter. At the same time that the Machzelas landed, you were Mevatel Reshus Hayochid being Reshus Hayochid. So according to Abaye the Pshitale, where he is clear, the machzel is mevatla mechitza, that when this vertical mat, which is now a screen dividing the shmaina into two parts, each one less than arba, so since it lands at the same time that it's mevatl, therefore your potter is kolshken chulya the mevatl mechitza. For sure, in Rabbi Yochanan Shail of yesterday, when you throw a shovel full of earth, a tefach of earth, into a pit that's 10 tefachim deep, for sure the earth is mevatl mechitza, because earth is for sure going to stay there longer and more permanent than a machzelas that divides it. Rabbi Yochanan was wondering about a chulya. What happens if you throw a shovel full of earth and it lands in a pit which is 10 tefachim deep? So at the same time that the earth comes to anocha, you diminish the asoret tefachim. If he has a shaila, the machzelas pshitad levatla mechitza, but the machzelas for sure is not as permanent as earth. Therefore, the machzelas is aimed to be taken out of there sooner. Therefore, that's not levatl the mechitza. V'omer Abaye says, Barber Shasarab Mamuka Asor Chovar Ba, if it's 10 tefachim deep and daled tefachim wide, Malay Mayim, if it's full of water, V'zorak L'toicha, and you throw something into it, you're chayiv because the bor is a Rishus HaYachid, and the water does not affect the pit from being a Rishus HaYachid. But if it's Malay Peiris, let's say it's full of grain, V'zorak L'toicha, and you throw something into it, Potter you potter. Why? Because my time, and Mayim Lo Mevatli Mechitzta. The water does not take away the mechitzas of Rosh Hashanah. It's a Rosh Hashanah with water in it. But the peiros are mevatel mechitzah. But the peiros are mevatel mechitzas. Now there's two pshatim in the Rishonim. What the chilik is between mayim and grain. According to the Ramban, it's because when the water is transparent, so therefore you can see the mechitzas. So therefore, the water has not been mevatel mechitzas because you can see the mechitzas. But the grain, since when the bor is full of grain, you can't see the mechitzas, so there's no longer any mechitzas nikores. The Meiri has a different shot. He says even when a pit is full of water, it's not mevatel rishus hayachid because you can still throw something into it, and some water will be displaced. But if you have grain, you can't throw anything into it. Therefore, it can no longer serve as a rishus hayachid. Meil Magen Avram and the Sfasem say that according to the Ramban, let's say if it's filled with glass, so according to the Ramban, if it's filled with glass which doesn't obstruct the view of the walls, so it would still be considered Rishus HaYachid. But according to the Meiri, since you couldn't put anything into it, even if it's filled with transparent glass, it's no longer Rishus HaYachid. And the Pri Megadim says, what happens, let's say, if you fill the pit with murky water or wine? If the key is that you have to be able to see the mechitzas, now you can't see the mechitzas. But if the key is like the Meiri, you can still throw something in, it's still considered Rishus HaYachid. So those are two chilukim between water and grain, right? Again, water you can still see the mechitzas, grain you can't see the mechitzas. Water you can still put something into the pit, grain you can't put something into the pit. Now we need to discuss what's the difference between, you remember yesterday we had, if you throw a fig against the wall, so the fig against the wall is not mamayit, the arba amas between the guy who threw it and the wall. So here there's three pshatim in the Rishonim. One pshat is because the fig is not going to stay there. But the fig is not going to stay there, so it's not mevatel the distance. But the grain is going to stay there for a longer amount of time. So that is mevatel the Rishus HaYachid. Another pshat is the fig is only in one spot. So if it's only one spot, that one spot, it's not enough to be mamai the shetach between the guy who threw it and the wall. Mashenkin, the grain covers the entire shetach of the bor, and therefore the entire shetach of the bor is covered, therefore it's mevatel. And the third is because by the grain you're mevatel the mechitzas because you can't see them. Mashenkin, this fig against the wall, you can clearly see the wall, so therefore the wall is there. It's a distance of arba amas between the guy who threw it and the wall. The arba amas is still there. Tanya Namiyochi, we learned to Braisa, which agrees with Abaye. Hazarik min hayam le'isratya, if you throw from the yam, which is a carmelis, onto a highway, which is a Rishus Rabim, or min isratya le'yam, or from the highway into the yam, you're potter. Why? Because it's mikarmelis l'Rishus Rabim, or Rishus Rabim le'karmelis. Reb Shimon says, if in the yam there is a cavity on the floor of the yam which is 10 tefachim deep and dalit al dalit, so that cavity, says Reb Shimon, is a reshus hayachid. The water in that cavity on the bottom of the yam is not mevatel reshus hayachid. Reshus hayachid is oilad l'rekia. So if you took water out over that cavity and you threw it into the street, you'd be chayiv for being a moitzi reshus hayachid l'reshus harabim. So you see, according to Reb Shimon, the mayim is not mevatel mechitza. The Rishonim ask, but according to the Tanakama, when you throw from the yam into the street, it is karmelis l'reshus harabim. So evidently holds that the water is mevatel mechitza. Is he arguing? So there's two pshatim in the Rishonim. One pshat is Reb Shimon and the Tanakama are not arguing. Tanakama says menayam, so the reshus harabim is mikarmelis l'reshus harabim, and Reb Shimon says he's right. It's mikarmelis l'reshus harabim unless you have a reshus hayachid, a pit which is 10 tefachim deep and dalit al dalit at the bottom of the yam. Then you have reshus hayachid down there, and the Tanakama would agree. So the Tanakama also agrees with Reb Shimon that the mayim is not mevatel mechitzta. There's another pshat in the Rishonim, the Rashba, Ridva, that Loilam, the Tanakama also agrees that the mayim is not mevatel mechitzta. Usually, if you have a bore with mayim in it, the bore is reshus hayachid. But if you have a whole yam, and the whole yam is a karmelis, just because there's a pit on bottom of the yam, which is dalit al dalit g'vay asora, the water in that pit is together with all the water of the rest of the yam, and therefore the entire thing is called a karmelis. And you don't create just a reshus hayachid, which is full of water, and a sea full of water, and create a new reshus hayachid. Look at Mishnah, we've had this so many times already. Hazarik arba amas b'kaisel, if you throw 4 amas at a wall, if it's l'mala mi'asar tefachim kazarik ba'aver, if it's at higher than 10 tefachim, it stops in a makam tur, because higher than 10 tefachim in reshus harabim is a makam tur. But lamata mi'asar, if it's lower than 10 tefachim high, it's kazarik ba'aretz, it's like you threw it into the reshus harabim, and as everybody knows, hazarik, if you throw an object ba'aretz arba amas b'reshus harabim, you are chayiv. So the Gemara asks the kasha, if you threw a tennis ball against the wall, it never stopped at the wall. We're talking about a sticky fig. So if the sticky fig stuck against the wall, then it's in the airspace of a makam tur. If the sticky fig sticks against the wall lower than asar tefachim, then it's in the aver of reshus harabim. We had this also before. Amar of Yudah Marab, Amar B'chia, Zorak l'mal mi'asara. If you throw something, let's say higher than 10 tefachim, and it lands in a hole in the wall, then bonu l'machlokes Rameir v'Rabbanan. Why? Because in order to be a reshus hayachid, you have to have dalit al dalit g'vay asara. Rameir damar chaykin la'ashlim mechayiv, l'Rabbanan damar ein chaykin la'ashlim loy mechayiv. I'll remind you, we had a case. Let's say if you have a doorway which is 10 tefachim high at the center, and it's 4 tefachim wide at the bottom, but then it arches, and at the top it comes to an arch, so it's not really 10 tefachim high by 4 tefachim wide across the entire height. So Rav Meir holds that if in the door frame there's enough room to carve out the top so that it'll now be 10 tefachim high by 4 tefachim wide, chaykin lahashlim, and it's chayiv b'mezuzah. The Rabbanan saying chaykin lahashlim, that right now this doorway is 10 tefachim high, but it's not dalet tefachim wide. So here also, this little hole which is in the wall, if you hold chaykin lahashlim, then imagine as if it's dalet al dalet and the gvay asara, so it's considered you threw reshus harabim l'reshus hayachid. If you hold ein chaykin lahashlim, you threw it into a small cavity which is less than the dimensions of reshus hayachid, and therefore you are potter. The Rabbeinu Chananel holds that this speaking where the cavity in the wall is 10 tefachim high, and therefore all that's missing is the dalet tefachim wide, and there Reb Meir holds chaykin lahashlim. Another Rishonim hold that in this case, even if the hole is tiny, you'd still say chaykin lahashlim. However, everybody's minded, by the way, that this is where the hole is on the reshus harabim side of the wall. But if the hole would be on the reshus hayachid side of the wall, or it goes through and through, then chure reshus hayachid, a hole which is off a reshus hayachid, for sure is considered a reshus hayachid. Tanya Nam Yochi, we learned to Brisa also, Zorak l'mala mi'asara v'olcha v'nacha b'chur kolshu. If you throw an object from reshus harabim and it's l'mala mi'asara and it lands in a small hole, Rav Meir is mechayev because he holds chaykin lahashlim, and it's as if it's dalet al dalet g'vay asara, v'cham and paitrim because they hold ein chaykin lahashlim. Next, Omer of Yudah Marav, Tel hamislaket mitoich arba v'zorak v'nach al gabav chayiv. What happens if in the reshus harabim you have the street angles upwards and it rises a height of 10 tefachim over a span that's less than arba amas from all 4 sides. So if it would be lower than 10 tefachim, or if it would rise to 10 tefachim, but the slope would be more level, then that's the contour of Rosh Hashanah. But if it rises so abruptly, the height of 10 tefachim in a span of less than Arba Ames, then right now you've got a Rishus HaYachid on top. As a machlokes achrayim, what this means. Let's say on top is for sure Rishus HaYachid, but let's say it slopes a bit upwards, and then it goes flat, and then it slopes a bit more upwards, and you land on the flat part. Is that flat part also considered the new Rishus HaYachid, or is it only Rishus HaYachid on top? So Reb Chaim Brisker holds that every part of that slope is now considered a wall, and it's all considered the wall of it Rishus HaYachid. Even if you land on the step, you had a hanocha Rishus HaYachid. The Chazon Ish says it's only Rishus HaYachid on top, because it needs the whole slope to rise to the top over a span of less than Arba Ames to become a height of Asar Tvachim to be Rishus HaYachid. Tanya Namiyachi, we have a brayza that corresponds to this. Mavui sheshava l'toichoi v'nasim madron l'rishus harabim. If you have a mavi which is flat, but at the outside of the mavi, right out of the door, it slopes 10 tefachim down to the rishus harabim. Or let's say shava l'rishus harabim, the rishus harabim is flat. V'nasim madron l'toichoi. Once the rishus harabim hits the mavi, inside the mavi, it slopes down. Oisa mavi ein etzarch le'lechi v'lei kaira. So you don't need a lechi or a kaira to be matir to carry in the mavi, because this slope, whether it's sloping down into the Rishus Harabim, sloping down into the mavi, itself is a mechitza. Rav Chanina ben Gamliel Leimer tell that this slope hamislaket that rises on a slant, asar tefachim mitach arba, 10 tefachim high within arba ames, v'zorik, and you throw something, v'nachal gabav lands on top, you're chayiv, because that has become a Rishus HaYachid within the Rishus Harabim. I'm going to pause here to record this, and then I'll record part 2.